Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this very timely webinar about fighting for DRIPA, which we're having today on the 180th anniversary of the Crown's claim to sovereignty over these lands that we call British Columbia. I'm Veronique Siufi. I'm the racial equity researcher and policy analyst with BC Policy Solutions. We work on the unceded stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And for those of you that may not be familiar with our work, maybe you're joining us for the first time today, BC Policy Solutions is a progressive public policy research institute. So we're looking for those policy redesigns that are going to make life in this province more sustainable, more affordable, and like we're talking about today, more just. So we've got economists calculating how we can, better redistribute wealth and how investments in public and social infrastructure are not only the right thing to do, but good for the economy. We've got social scientists like myself doing community-driven research. We're also a hub for cross-collaboration across community organizations, nonprofits, academics, and the labor movement. And of course, we also try and make the work that we do accessible to all of you, kind of like what you're tuning in for today. So today we're here to talk about the friction, Indigenous peoples are experiencing in implementing the rights that they should have always had. And we've got two great guests that I'll introduce shortly, but I'll just set the context a little bit for why we're having this conversation today. In 2019, the BC legislature unanimously passed the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act with the intent of bringing, BC's laws and regulations in line with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So this includes things like the right to self-determination and to self-government, the right to participate in decision-making and to free, prior and informed consent, the right to own, use, develop, and control their traditional lands, territories, and resources, and a commitment on the part of the state to redress and restitution. And so DRIPA marked a really important step towards reconciliation. It was precedent setting for BC. The ongoing, that effort of reconciliation, that ongoing work of repairing the harms of settler colonialism, including acknowledging the dispossession on which this province was built, uh, you know, restoring Indigenous sovereignty and finding a just way for settlers and First Nations to share these lands. But recently, in the wake of two landmark court decisions, so the Cowichan decision and the Sala decision, where the government was held accountable to its commitments, the BC government then announced it would actually amend or maybe suspend parts of DRIPA. We saw fierce resistance on the part of First Nations and civil society deterred the government for now, but the province is still intending to appeal the two court decisions that led to this conversation in the first place. So the Declaration Act was supposed to help First Nations move these fights for the recognition of their rights out of the courts and put them at the negotiating table instead. It's the province's own failure to implement that commitment that has driven First Nations back to court. And by challenging those court decisions and threatening to use its legislative power to amend or suspend DRIPA, the government has not only revealed an ongoing colonial mentality, but they've also exacerbated a conservative backlash against Indigenous rights and title, despite First Nations repeatedly demonstrating their commitment to respect private property. So I have two esteemed guest speakers with us today to help us, walk through this conversation. I've got Dr. Lorna Wanosta Williams, who's an esteemed member of the Lil'wat First Nation and Professor Emerita of Indigenous Education, Curriculum, and Instruction at the University of Victoria, where she was the first Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Knowledge and Learning and the first director of the school's Indigenous Education program. And Dr. Williams is a recipient of the Order of Canada for her work. And Lorna is joined by her co-author, Dr. John Price, Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Victoria and Associate Fellow at the Center for Global Studies. So he's a public historian with a focus, among others, on Indigenous settler relations in the Pacific Northwest. So Dr. Price is co-author of Challenging Racist British Columbia, 150 Years and Counting, and co-editor of a special volume of BC Studies, Unsettling the Islands, Race, Indigeneity, and the Trans-Pacific. And I'm so glad to be having this conversation with these two guests. In their upcoming report, Lorna and John write, Indigenous people in the province are once again faced with a colonial world intent on taking back changes that First Nations have fought for over the past 180 years, as successive governments confined them to reserves, dispossessed them of their lands, and then sold or gave those lands to white settlers. This political confrontation also resonates with deep cultural differences in which the colonial world conceives of the land as being owned, and ownership translates into economic terms. The land is monetized. Whereas for the Indigenous world, it's not about who owns the land, it's about who is looking after that land. So I'm going to start with a conversation with our guests. I have a few questions for them, and then I'll save some time for questions from the audience. So if folks have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. So, Lorna, after all of that, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start our conversation by asking you, how are you feeling about all of this talk of repealing DRIPA? I know it's been such a long fight. I know DRIPA was hard won, but I also know this, of course, isn't your first rodeo of this, roller coaster back and forth. Is this moment similar in any way to the efforts around the Constitution Express?
It's when the pattern with what's been happening with DRIPA is pretty similar, to many other things that have happened in our history. And it's an example is the Constitution Express that took place in the early 1980s. And that came about because when Canada was going to patriate the Constitution, it decided that Indigenous people would not be included in the conversation. And some of our leaders, George Manuel, Harold Cardinal, and many others across the country, decided that we would do the Constitution Express, and community people would travel across the country. And many of the women in our communities and organizations organized this complicated trip. And I think it was, with what happened with that. By the time we got to Ottawa, it had shifted, and but then shortly after we left Ottawa, it changed, and so then the group decided to go on to Europe to enlist support from the European governments that were part of colonizing Canada, and also third and fourth world um, countries. And as a result, we were included in Section 35 in the Constitution. But and women were given rights back because women in our country had no rights in the communities, and so at least with this, that's what happened. The women got the rights back to their homelands, but we didn't know, for example, right away that only lasted 2 generations. The third generation could also then lose their status and rights to their homelands. And so, this pattern with Canada is ongoing. It's it's similar with every move that takes place that we have to, that we have to fight for, and um, so it isn't any different, unfortunately.
That is unfortunate to hear. Maybe, John, I'll ask you, we're having this conversation today because it's the anniversary of the signing of the Oregon Treaty. Maybe can you just start by telling us what is the Oregon Treaty exactly? How does it help us understand these questions about sovereignty versus title?
Yeah, thanks so much, Veronique. I want to recognize Lorna and also a couple of other Indigenous colleagues at the University of Victoria, Nick Claxton and Christine O'Bonsawin, who have really played an important role in getting me to understand that in the end, it's all about the land. So the Treaty of Oregon was signed by representatives of the British Empire and the U.S. Secretary of State 180 years ago on this day, June 15th, 1846. So why are we talking about this, right? This old treaty that, few people have read and, make much of. Most of us are now used to giving or hearing land acknowledgements in which we talk about the unceded territory that belongs to First Nations. After, as Lorna explained, Section 35 came in, all of a sudden courts had to pay more attention to Indigenous title and rights. And I just want to emphasize Lorna was part of that Constitution Express, as were hundreds, if not thousands, of other First Nations. And so, it's important not to claim that as Canadian. Those are rights that were fought for by First Nations. They received some support, obviously, from allies, but it's not because of the benevolence of the state that we have this. It's because of the hard-fought battle of First Nations. And this is why when we talk about or give territorial acknowledgements, we have to understand that when First Nations go to court, they still have to go through a terribly exhaustive and expensive process if they want to prove Indigenous title, that they have to prove that they actually lived and worked on the land for which they're claiming title. That was the case in the recent Cowichan decision, in which the court recognized their title over a small section of land on the Fraser River. So in those types of court cases, the Crown also has to show the basis upon which it asserts Crown sovereignty. And they do that not through presenting evidence of occupation, but instead they refer to the Oregon Treaty, which they assert gave them sovereignty over all of the lands in the province. It's the basis for Crown title, and in fact, most other forms of private property are spin-offs of this same Crown title. And just a note for people who aren't used to the language of Crown title, the Crown comes from the monarchy, right? From the wearing of the crown by Queen Victoria or whoever succeeded her. And so for myself, as somebody whose grandparents took Kwantlen land near Langley over 100 years ago, and as a historian, I was really curious about this treaty and so began to look into it. And the treaty itself is quite short and for the most part just defines the border between the US and Canada. Most historians just accept it as that, a border treaty. But there's a short reference in the treaty that states it was to end the previous ambiguity, quote, respecting the sovereignty and government of the territory of the northwest coast of America. And the courts, including the Supreme Court of Canada, have made it clear that the 1846 treaty is when, and I quote, the Crown, that is the state, acquired radical or underlying title to all the land in British Columbia at the time of sovereignty. So the treaty is not just some dusty archival document. It's a living document that the courts and the settler state, if you like, the colonial state still relies on. And so, I decided to look into this more, and you can't see what was the justification. On what basis did they assert sovereignty? Did the British Empire and the U.S. Empire assert this claim to sovereignty? And so I went down to the wonderful Vancouver Public Library, and in their rare book collections, I found this volume called the British Parliamentary Papers, Volume 2, Canadian Boundary, and it contains the official minutes of all the discussions. And if you read this, what you see is that the only argument they could muster, and they went back and forth because the Americans wanted to claim all of the territory, including what's now British Columbia, and the British also wanted to claim all the territory that's now Washington and Oregon. So they go back and forth, but all they can talk about is how Captain Vancouver visited in 1788 and stayed for a week or two, right? Or Captain Cook came in 1778, sorry, and then Captain Vancouver came a few years later. And this is the basis for which they say that all of this land was British property. There's no mention of the thousands of First Nations who lived, governed, and worked across these territories for millennia. It's not that the officials didn't know this. They knew there was tens and hundreds of thousands of First Nations on the land, but they purposefully neglected to discuss it, and they in order to make the case, they essentially had to erase First Nations in order to turn the land into what's known as terra nullius, that is, uninhabited land, and then claim it as its own. So that's the reason, the justification, which is no justification in all, and it's a form of the doctrine of discovery, right? That's been discredited. It has no legal basis whatsoever. And so even the Vatican has repudiated the doctrine of discovery now. So it's still important to understand the treaty because after they proclaim sovereignty through the treaty, 3 years later, Queen Victoria gives all the land of Vancouver Island to the Hudson's Bay Company, right? I mean, this is not trivial stuff. This is not minutia of history. This is power being exercised by an empire. And so we need to understand that. For myself as a settler, whose land my grandparents took, and Indigenous land was taken from continent territories. I want to know about this, and I want others to know about it as well. And so the Treaty of Oregon is, in my opinion, pretty important.
And so this is putting First Nations in a position in court of having to demonstrate that they were there. Like, this is the date where they have to demonstrate, this was our land before this point, and that's the effort that they have to put in. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct, and it's also it's when the whole colonial apparatus that rises up, the pushing of First Nations onto reserves. They did that. The colonial authorities did that because they felt the land was theirs. They believed it. They believed the Treaty of Oregon what gave them the legal right to do that, even though we know today that it's a legal fiction. And what was really behind it, of course, was that they wanted the territory, they wanted the resources to exploit. But in terms of what First Nations today face, they're trying to reclaim and reassert their sovereignty, but so many roadblocks are being put up. But Lorna has been so involved, the progress that has been made despite those roadblocks in Indigenous language revitalization, reclaiming sovereignty over education. Lorna can perhaps talk about these things better than me.
Yes, I do have a question for you, Lorna, about how we can rethink our relationship to the land and to each other. But I think before I ask you that, maybe John, just to wrap up this part around the treaty, one of the fears that's been stoked is around people's private property and homes. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about, are those fears valid, or what is it that's been, kind of conflating this idea about reclaiming Aboriginal title versus people's private property and the risk to that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, around the DRIPA and in regards to the Cowichan case, First Nations, the First Nations Leadership Council, the Cowichan Nation. If you look at the Haida agreement that was signed, First Nations are declaring clearly that they are not out to threaten private property. I don't know how many times they have to say it before they'll be believed, right? That's the problem. There is a right wing that is using this to try and incite anti-Indigenous racism. And so they have a vested interest in not listening. So at the same time, we also know that many legal experts say that Indigenous title and private property can coexist, just as Crown title and private property coexist at present. So there's no real threat to the land. The threat to the land is not from First Nations. For God's sake, First Nations have been protecting the land for how many years, and now they're being accused of threatening it. It's crazy. We know the threat comes from other places, from the environmental catastrophe that's been taking place.
Yeah, I think that that's a good place to jump in. And Lorna, I'll turn to you because I think a lot of this comes from ignorance about Indigenous knowledge and relationship to the land. So maybe, you've spent a large part of your life as an educator, so I'll ask you to do some more education for us today. And part of what you've been doing is bringing Indigenous knowledge into the classroom. So, how can Indigenous knowledge help us as settlers rethink our relationship to the land and to each other?
Yeah, before I get into that, I just like to say that all this talk about private property and displacement, people need to also really think about what happened when our people were put on reserves. We got displaced, we got relocated, we got confined, and the settlers that came in took our land. And my name, Williams, comes from the family that took our land. And our house is still, you could still see remnants on what is now their property. But his name was given to my grandfather, and who didn't have an English name. And that's how we got our that name. And we have to live with that. Every time I say my name, I have to remember that I'm saying the name of the man who took our land and displaced us to the poorest, unlivable part of our territory. And we had to make do there. That's what Canadians tend to not want to think about or remember or even talk about. And we talk about the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' history and our knowledges. They don't exist in today's education system. And education was the primary tool to get rid of us, to annihilate us, to make us invisible, to make us inhuman, to make us uncivilized. That's what education did and continues to do. And so it's no surprise that settlers claim they don't know. They don't want to know. And and every time you talk about us, that's what comes into their minds is that Indigenous peoples of these lands were going to be disappearing anyway because we didn't know how to live. Not thinking that we've been here for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years and thriving on our lands. And not only thriving on our lands, but also the lands too could continue to thrive because we had a good relationship with the land and knew that they nourished us and we needed each other. And I've been working in education because my community of Mount Currie was the first band controlled school in on this side of the Rocky Mountains. And, there were many others starting up too. But we began, and our job was finally to let our people talk about their history and to know their history, because even to our people, because they were, we were sent to residential school and the federal government controlled our education. We weren't able to know who we were and what our history was. And finally we could. And the other part of the education system was to bring our languages back. And we began, even though because we were in the mountains and isolated, our language in 1970s was still strong, but we could see that it was shifting, and the people said our children need to speak our language, and because our language is what tells us who we are and what our relationship is to the land. And because our languages until the 70s were oral languages, and all our knowledges were passed down through the language in stories, in songs, and yes, in petroglyphs. And but it was in the stories that all of our history was located. And when our languages began to go, so did our history. And also, in our languages, I watch now people reconstructing our language. And it's so beautiful to listen and to watch people rediscover the complexity of our thought systems, our ways of working together, helping each other, supporting each other, and also supporting, the ancestors and the descendants and the land, and all that live on the land, even the bugs. And so, right now my community is fighting for time for one of our beautiful glacier parks to sit alone. And because our land needs to reheal itself, and but settlers just don't understand that relationship. They think that everything is theirs and for their use. They don't think about relationship. And and that's something that I've tried to bring to the public education system, because Canadians need to know. They need to understand, they need to know our history, our true history. And but it's been something that Canada has left out of the whole education system from kindergarten to university. And that's something that we're working on. People across the country are working on this and trying to change this. But it's extremely challenging because, as I said, Canadians don't want to know, and because it serves them to not know.
Thank you, Lorna. So John, maybe I'll ask you, Lorna's kind of just described how these different relationships to the land, these different ways of being and ways of knowing are embodied in Indigenous languages. Uh, you know, Given what Lorna has just shared with us, how do you envision settlers here taking up these lessons? What do you see for maybe, let's say, the near future, or the hopeful future
Yeah.
of settler Indigenous relations?
Yeah, thanks for that. And thanks, Lorna, for your words just now. I have to say that, I learned a lot when I was working on these issues about 10 years ago with Nick Claxton and others. And when we started out, we looked at the question from the point of view of trying to figure out, quote unquote, whose land is it, right? that was the question. That was even the title of the article that was in BC Studies that was published about 5 years ago. And we were trying to show that First Nations really exercised sovereignty and that settler claims were not really supportable. In the end, however, sage elders and educators sort of came to our rescue, because you can easily get trapped in this sort of them and us, binary. And in the end, we were told, we were on the wrong track. And the question, whose land is it, is actually the wrong question. In the end, we understood that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. And until we get that straight, we're going to continue to face huge challenges. And that's why learning from First Nations is so important. The thing that I would like to mention is that, I want to, first of all, acknowledge the wonderful work that First Nations Leadership Council and First Nation generally, as well as allies such as Policy Solutions, but Civil Liberties and lawyers associations made in, trying to stop all the nonsense around DRIPA and the rollback of DRIPA. That was really, really important. But I think what we're looking at is the need to find a different way of approaching settler-Indigenous relations. In 2019, the legislature unanimously passed DRIPA, unanimously, right? Which is like, okay. But now we see they're ready to go back on it really quickly, right? And so what we may have seen in 2019 was what we might call performative reconciliation, right? Where we're going to, in words, recognize the wrong of the past, and in words, try and resolve it. But then we see when things get down to brass tacks, settler colonial governments are ready to stomp on DRIPA. And corporations are questioning DRIPA. The BC Business Council put out a poll that says 98% of their members are worried about DRIPA, right? This is a part of a large-scale blowback against Indigenous rights. And it's the way polarization that's occurring around the world is going to be taking place here in British Columbia. Indigenous rights and title have become the focal point. So it's important, I think, that we move beyond performative reconciliation. And, in my limited experience, admittedly limited, I have come to see that First Nations don't necessarily look at reconciliation in the same way. The Heiltsuk Nation, for example, has adopted the term Halsatut as their guide for me moving forward. It means to turn things around and make things right again. Similarly, Elder Francois Paulette, a member of Smith's Landing First Nation, Treaty 8, says, quote, "In my language, when we do harm to somebody and we make amends, we say nula yet." What that means is let's take down and start over. In other words, we need a real rethink about how this province operates. And it's not so easy. Unfortunately, governments and corporations are hell-bent on fast-tracking massive resource projects. With the Treaty of Oregon, the Hudson's Bay Company and many other corporations began the exhaustive exploitation of the forests that are now depleted, the oceans that are now depleted, and now it's LNG and minerals, right? They can't seem to go beyond that colonial extractive exploitation model. And this is only going to exacerbate things. So as Lorna emphasized, the colonial world conceives of the land as being owned. For the Indigenous world, it's not about who owns the land, it's about who's looking after the land. And I think we need to learn about that and figure out new ways of so that Indigenous peoples and First Nations can work together on the pressing issues of our time. And I think that Lorna, I should say that, we put out the article in Rabble. It's derived from the paper that we're working on, but it's been such a valuable experience, and I feel totally privileged to have worked with Lorna, and she's taught me so much about how, hunters on her territory transmitted knowledge to people and young people in the village through their experiences. And these stories are so important, and so I hope Lorna can share some more of those stories with us.
Well, I know I said I would go to the Q&A, but I see a comment in the chat that I think picks up right from where we are right now in this conversation, which is, wondering, someone in the chat wonders about whether this fear that settlers have about, Indigenous people having their land back and having title back, whether it's like after all of these years of doing incredible harm, there's a fear that somehow that harm will come back to settlers, for what, which is, I think, part and parcel of the way of thinking that we're brought up with, and the relationship that we have to the land. So, I can see how learning and education could be part of undoing this fear. But I don't know if either of you want to speak a bit to that. I'm sure you've come across this idea before of settlers being afraid of being, what they've done to others being done to them. I mean, colonial powers all over.
I'd like to begin by saying I grew up in my community. As I was saying, my community um, was a very traditional community. Even though we got put on reserves, we still lived our way of life. And I remember when the settlers were newly coming into our valley. They were taking our land. And as I was saying, we got our names from them, the people who took our lands. And but even so, I want people to know that even so, our people helped those settlers when they arrived because our lands are harsh, and our winters were hard, and and the land was land that people didn't know. And even though we were displaced and lost everything, our people helped them. And those people remember, but their offspring don't remember that. And so even though we were displaced, we helped. And because, I remember asking my uncle where he got all his harnesses, and he told me that they came from a family, a German family, that had been settlers in our valley, and he had helped them get settled, and to be able to deal with our harsh winters. And when that German family got displaced in the Second World War, because Germans too got displaced along with the Japanese, when that family was being displaced, he gave all those harnesses and his livestock to my uncle, because he remembered how he was helped, his family was helped. And and it was there are lots of those kinds of stories. Our people, even though they were displaced by settlers, helped. And because that's our way, that's our traditional way. This whole interpretation and meaning of land ownership is comes from a very colonial place. And one of the fears that people can have is that some of our people have grown up in a very colonial world, and that's what they know. And But there are still people in all of our communities who know our traditional ways, and it's a very different world and a very different way than the colonial world. And it's important to know that there are differences. And so, yes, people need to be afraid because they've taught their colonial way of viewing ownership and not helping very, very well to some of our young people.
Thank you, Lorna. I've got another question in the chat for you if you're up for doing a back-to-back, which is someone's interested in knowing what you think about reciprocity trust. So this is where, through a trust, um, folks can make a monthly payment, which in effect acknowledges the lands of the First Nations, and decolonizes our backyards, as the trust put it. So then the money is distributed among participating First Nations to use as they see fit. So it is this, this might be a simple but practical way for individuals to make an acknowledgement that's more real and meaningful. But I guess the question is, would this be enough, or are we looking for more through DRIPA?
Yeah, that it's very complicated. That question. I've been working with an organization called First Peoples Cultural Council and the foundation. And there have been people who've provided funds to help us to reclaim our languages, our knowledge systems, and to cope with what we need to cope with today with technology, for example, um, and to work on archiving our knowledge systems so that they can be shared. I agree with being able to do that. What I've seen in some communities where people have given funds, there are some communities that I think who are able to and can use those funds in a very strategic way. But there are others where it's become a real issue because we don't we tend not to money is kind of like a part, and and um, and sometimes what's happened with it is that people have then denied, for example, membership to communities because they don't want to share the funds, and like it's just become really complicated. So if there's some other way that people can contribute that helps us to do the work that we need to do, I agree with that. I really I support that. We have our people have so much work to do at all levels and in so many areas. Bringing people back home, people who got disconnected from their communities because of the Ministry of Social Services that took children away from their families, and they grew up away. And there are so many ways in which our people were dislocated because the government thought that's it was going to how it was going to get rid of us. And so all this work of reconnecting and revitalizing our languages, our knowledge systems, our relationship with the land, maintaining those are all extremely important. So
Mm.
people can think of ways to use the funds rather than just leaving it for distribution.
Thanks, Lorna. Yeah, what I'm hearing is this is another way of seeing the land in a monetary framework, rather, which, the money is helpful and needed as a tool, but doesn't replace that sovereignty, doesn't replace that, ability to not just self-govern, but redevelop economies on your own land. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question, which maybe this is for you, John. It's someone would like to know a little bit more about the idea of coexisting titles. So, what is this difference between like the crown, fee simple ownership? And so they're trying to understand. First Nations may have, if they get their land back, regional jurisdiction, the same as maybe municipal government or the crown, and then a private owner would have fee simple title on top of that. And then maybe the nation is taxing them and developing bylaws. Like, is our audience understanding this correctly?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would first of all just like to come back to the Gitsala decision, which has put into question the Mineral Tenure Act, and this gets to the question of crown sovereignty and crown title. Right now, even if you have private property, you don't have any right to what's under the surface of your land. The crown owns that. And what's incredible is that this system of assigning the power to exploit or to explore what's under the lands is a system that is absolutely colonial and has been more or less unchanged for over 150 years. Anybody can stake a claim electronically to the minerals underneath a piece of land. There's a few exceptions, but crown title is already draconian in that sense, and so the threat to private property really, First Nations do not represent a threat. To be sure, as these issues are worked out, the question of crown title versus Indigenous title, what that means to homeowners, etc. These can get complicated, many legal questions, and the only way we can deal with it is to put aside the idea that this and First Nations represent a threat and are going to take away private property. First of all, that has to be set aside as just fear-mongering, racism, etc. Having said that, of course, as we work through these issues, new systems of working are going to have to evolve. The Mineral Tenure Act, which the government seems intent on continuing, is like it's craziness. So there's going to have to be major changes in how we deal with things, and how do we bring about those changes in a way that brings people together as opposed to forcing them apart. And that's the question that I don't think, again, there are many lawyers, many who are perhaps participating in this webinar, who know a lot more about this than I do in terms of how the different regimes, the Indigenous title and crown title and private property or fee simple, can coexist or not. But right now, it's not Indigenous title that is threatening private property. First of all, if we go back, it's not First Nation. Who burnt down the towns of Lytton and Jasper, right? The forest fires, right, that destroyed Lytton and nearly destroyed the whole of Jasper were not lit by First Nations. This was the result of colonial exploitation, global climate change, climate warming. And so that's the threat to the land. Who, created the situation where the Fraser Valley was totally flooded a few years ago, right? Destroying crops and destroying housing and all that. Again, climate change, things that, First Nations are not responsible for. First Nations, I think, have taught us that they have learned to look after the forest and the land in a different way, and we need to learn from them, right? And so I just want to emphasize that whatever the legal issues may be, and they're complicated and they're going to have to be worked out over time. First Nation, Indigenous rights and title is not a threat. And secondly, First Nations have always come to the rescue. I mean, Lorna talked about her experience in Lillooet territory, but First Nations are always coming to help settler communities in their times of need, right? So, we have to embrace that, and we have to see ways of going forward. And that may require major changes in the way we do things in British Columbia, but it's necessary in order to move forward.
Yeah, and I've got this is definitely more of a comment than a question, but I actually think it's an important comment worth bringing in at this point, which is, you know, someone here has a quote from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which is that reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians from an Aboriginal perspective also requires reconciliation with the natural world. If human beings resolve problems between themselves but continue to destroy the natural world, then reconciliation remains incomplete. This is a perspective that we as commissioners have repeatedly heard, that reconciliation will never occur unless we are also reconciled with the earth. So I thought that was worth sharing because it sounds like exactly what you were both, Lorna and John, pointing to today. I worry that I don't have time for us to tackle one more question. So I think what I'm going to do is give you each the opportunity, maybe for sharing a final thought with us and a call to action. You've got, 150 folks in this room. This recording will be shared with, the 300 plus folks who registered, and hopefully folks will share it with their friends. So, while you have this audience, can you share a final thought with us and maybe a call to action for the audience?
Well,
Maybe Lorna, yeah.
I think that what I'm going to ask people to do, and I ask it of myself, is to really to continue to learn, even though it is a struggle. Um, but there are lots of people, when you put it out into the universe, that you want to know what the history was and what the relationship is supposed to be, it comes. And we're all on this beautiful, beautiful land, and we need to care for it, and we need to care for each other.
Thank you, Lorna.
Yeah, I think that we have a wonderful opportunity here, in the sense that this crisis around DRIPA, and the crisis that's going to arise if the government continues to challenge Indigenous title and rights that are affirmed in court decisions, like in Gitchala or in Cowichan, etc. The crisis is going to continue, and so again, I want to really raise my hands in appreciation of the work of so many organizations who stood up when DRIPA was being threatened, both inside the caucus of the NDP and outside, and forced David Eby to back down. And we don't know what's going on in terms of discussions and negotiations between the government and the First Nations Leadership Council that are taking place instead of the amendment or repeal of DRIPA. But we know that the crisis will continue because the business community is now, really taking it on. The right wing is taking it on. The new leader of the Conservative Party is demanding the repeal of DRIPA. And so this has become a flashpoint. So I think we have to build on the wonderful work that's been done up until date, up to now, and continue the fight to defend DRIPA and support First Nations also in their various claims and endeavors, whether it be around Indigenous language revitalization or in other matters. So I think we need to make that transparent. Settlers have to stand up with First Nations and support First Nations going forward. And so I think that continuing to learn the history of the province, going beyond stereotypes, calling out racism when we see it happening, and standing up to the government together and working together is the way that we'll be able to, create new relations moving forward.
Thank you so much to both of you. And yeah, I think for those in the room that might feel maybe exhausted by the poly crises that we're in, the affordability crisis, the environmental crisis, like I think it's important to remember that um, this is an issue worth fighting for because it's at the core of those crises. If we don't solve this one, we will not have economic stability. You know, this is the most important piece of the puzzle for environmental sustainability. So I do really encourage all of you to respond to these calls to action. So thank you to our guests, Dr. Lorna Williams and John Price, for sharing their expertise with us and walking us through these issues. Thank you to all of you for attending and engaging. We'll be sharing the recording of today's webinar with all of those who registered, so please do share the recording with those that you think need to hear this. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be notified when Lorna and John's publication comes out, and so then you can share that piece too. And if you found this useful, please consider supporting our work by making a donation. I think Marinella has shared that link in the chat. And so thanks again to all of you for being here, and I hope you'll join us for future conversations.